obviously there is a lot of tension in our society around the issue of psychedelic intoxication, around the issue of these shamanic plants, though there is a growing awareness among sophisticated people that the case is almost entirely emotional. In other words, we tolerate outlandishly toxic drugs, alcohol, tobacco. We're willing to make a trade-off of 70,000 deaths a year in this country for the privilege of driving the automobile, so forth and so on. We tolerate very toxic practices if they are seen to be somehow supportive of the agenda being handed down from the top. Psychedelics are not, and they are seen as tremendously disruptive, and yet, as the ethnographic and pharmacological data comes in, they are among the most benign substances in the world, and their history of human usage is almost universal. And then the question is, do these intoxications limit the spectrum of consciousness and allow hierarchical models to be handed down and brainwashed into the doubters? Or do these states of consciousness dissolve cultural assumptions and cast the individual into an ocean of existential perplexity out of which they have to build their own model of how the world works? Well, I believe the reason for this tension in our society and anxiety and suppression, furious suppression of these things, is because we sense that this addresses origins in the same way that it took a long time to overcome our queasiness about discussing sexuality. There's something about the origin subjects that make us very, very nervous. Now, the contemporary situation worldwide is that we find many forms of shamanism, from the Arctic to the rainforest tropics, and shamanism always depends for its efficacy on a dislocation or a transformation of ordinary consciousness. And we see this achieved in many different ways, through fasting, through ordeal, meaning abandonment in the wilderness or flagellation, through elaborate theatrical effects, special effects, through the use of substances in plants. And there has been a controversy in anthropology, never resolved over the past 40 years. What is the authentic shamanism? And those of you who are anthropologists know that Merceliade, who was one of the great experts in this field, claimed, he called use of plants in a shamanic context decadent. He called the use of such plants narcotic. Well, first of all, the use of the word narcotic in that context shows you don't know what you're talking about in terms of pharmacology. That's a totally obsolete and silly category, and not true to boot. Psychedelics are in no sense narcotic. Gordon Wasson, on the other hand, who was a brilliant amateur and the discoverer of the psilocybin cults in Mexico, along with his partner and wife, Valentina Wasson, took just the opposite position and said, no, use of plants to transform consciousness is the primary method, where there is resort to ordeal, fasting, wilderness abandonment, so forth and so on. This is the derivative, late arriving, decadent shamanism. In fact, this is shamanism on its way to turning into religion of the ordinary sort. And in fact, if we look at religion of the ordinary sort, we see that it does have a place for fasting. It does have a place for self-flagellation. It does admit those techniques, but no organized religion of any size tolerates the use of psychedelics in consciousness transforming amounts. And that little parenthetical phrase is there because one of the things that you should know and remember and keep always in front of you is that if you wish to control someone, or if you want to brainwash somebody, the way you do it is with small amounts of drugs and large amounts of your message, whatever it is. So, but if you give people large amounts of a psychedelic, your message will take its place in the parade of ideas and find its relative importance. So using drugs does not mean, if you come upon a cult or a group or an individual using psychedelic substance, it doesn't necessarily mean that they are on a path of spiritual and shamanic transformation. It may be that they just are self-enforcing some private Idaho of illusion in which they choose to live. But if large doses are being taken, and by large, I simply mean effective, full spectrum doses. One of the wonderful things about these substances is that the effective dose is a long ways away from a dangerous dose. The LD50, in other words, is very favorable. The boundary, so then let me talk for a minute about the character of this experience generally. What is the plant hallucinogen experience in all times and all places for all people? I mean, I don't know if you can be that general, but it's important to try. What it is it's an experience of boundary dissolution. It's an experience of having categories obliterated, of having previously defined boundaries and differences eliminated. The enterprise of being and the enterprise of language is basically an enterprise of defining boundaries. I am myself, you are you, this is now, that was then, we are here, they are there. These are provisional distinctions about reality that make it necessary, that are necessary for us to keep track of and manipulate our animal body as a machine in Newtonian space. But when a shaman takes a psychoactive plant at an effective dose, he or she falls into trance, becomes immobile, and then the geometry of consciousness, if you wish, is melted and recast in a different geometry. And I use these mathematical terms because I really sincerely believe that at some hypothetical future date, when this is all sorted out, what we're going to realize about the psychedelic experience is that it is the experience of the fact of the higher geometry of the universe in which we live. In other words, it's very easy to see that ordinary consciousness evolved to, well, let me put it this way, it's a wonderful aphorism. Consciousness takes the contours of the vessel into which it is poured. It's like water. It always takes the shape of the vessel into which it is poured. And so what are we? We are, on the large scale, we are animals in three-dimensional space, given to hunting and given to being hunted. So what has consciousness done? It has evolved into a kind of threat, anticipation, detection, and avoidance machine. The purpose of consciousness, the purpose of your eyes, the coordination of your sensa is to navigate you through the world without dying, without being ripped apart by predators or being caught in landslides or rushing rivers, so forth and so on. And consciousness fills that need, ordinary consciousness, very well. But because the body has a locus in three-dimensional space, consciousness of the ordinary sort tends to surround the body as an object of concern. In other words, if you're worried about being hit by traffic, you're not worried about being hit by traffic in Berkeley. You're worried about being hit in traffic in San Francisco because that's where you happen to be. So consciousness of the ordinary sort tends to cluster around the physical body. But when consciousness is dissolved of that concern and dissolved of the programming in language that concern has built up over ages, it recrystallizes in a higher dimension, literally a kind of hyperspace. And if you will think for a moment about shamanism, I think you'll see how literally we can take this mathematical metaphor of the psychedelic experience. What is a classic shaman expected to do and be? Well, shamans predict hunting. They see where the game will be. Shamans predict weather. They can tell what the weather will be. Shamans are brought in to mediate complex social hassles of the who is sleeping with my woman, who stole the chicken, who shat in the stream kind of social hassles. Shamans are brought in for these kinds of purposes. And then finally and most importantly, shamans cure. They cure sometimes. Well, now, these things, predicting the weather, seeing where the game went, curing, and having a deep insight into social interaction, these are things which become completely non-mysterious if we hypothesize that the shaman has a hyperspatial point of view. You know, if you went into a mathematical if we had a safe here, and we could go into hyperspace, we would discover that the safe is open, that there is words are difficult here, but there is a side of the safe, or let's say a dimension to the safe, which isn't locked. In the same way that if a hyperspatial entity were looking down on San Francisco, it could reach into this room without coming through the door and rearrange things. In other words, everything that we call magic, seeing the future, seeing into locked boxes, knowing what is going to happen, becomes utterly non-mysterious if you hypothesize that consciousness can unfold itself under this peculiar pharmacodynamic situation into a higher dimensional space. And that becomes important in the modern context more than in the archaic context, because the collective future has become for us a focus of major anxiety. We need to know where we're going. You know, Marshall McLuhan said, the way we run our societies is like driving an automobile using only the rear view mirror. Well, in shamanically guided societies, they actually turn on the headlights. Running by the rear view mirror means you only have past experience to guide you. Running with the headlights on means you actually have an insight into the forward dimension into which you're moving. Okay, so that is sort of a broad sketch of how one plant, psilocybin, may have catalyzed, shaped, impacted human consciousness, how the abandonment of that archaic shamanic style through climatic change created the fall into history, how the fall into history is the absence of this hyperdimensional point of view. And then what we'll talk about when we come back after the break is how can we utilize the botanical and ethnographic and pharmacological data that we have garnered in the last 100 years to recapture, revivify, and explore this dimension of human potential in such a way that we can actually inject some hope into our political circumstances. I don't believe if we remain as we are, half angel, half monkey, ruled by dominant hierarchies, ruled by the most ruthless among us, that we have much of a future on the evolutionary stage. But I think that if we can recapture the lost symbiosis with these psychoactive plants, that we will in fact be recovering a lost portion of ourselves, that history is a progressive dehumanizing of the human experience. And we have now, in the 20th century, reached the level of dehumanizing where you've got the Holocaust, potential thermonuclear war, Bosnia, Rwanda, you name it. I mean, the scale of brutality, bruteness in the 20th century indicates to me that the struggle for the soul of humanity is reaching an incredibly intense crescendo. And I really believe that the path forward is backward, that we need an archaic revival, and that central to that revival will be the personality and the technology of shamanism. And when we analyze that technology for its effectiveness, we will discover that the most interesting things in the shamanic toolbox are the plants which directly intervene in the functioning of human consciousness. Are there questions to this point? Or shall I just keep plodding? Yes.
I have a question about the problem of the idea of a tendency towards male dominance that's suppressed chemically, which allows for a magical sort of existence only under chemical sort of suppression that we weren't able to breed out over thousands of years. What is that? I mean, do we have to mainline men for the rest of throughout eternity?
Well, I think the implication is yes. In other words, had we remained monkeys, we never would have gotten into this crazy situation. We became human by forming a relationship, a symbiotic relationship with a psychoactive plant, and then we became semi-human when we abandoned it. And that's what we are now, semi-human. You know, we're capable of enormous acts of kindness and appalling acts of brutality. I think conscious self-reflection can help here. I mean, if you know this story and believe it, and if evidence, God knows what evidence would look like, but if evidence could be found to support it, then it makes it easier to understand our dilemma. I mean, men don't want to dominate, and it's not a man-woman issue either. Personality, the ego is a sort of genderless way of attacking this thing. The ego was suppressed by psilocybin. And in the absence of psilocybin, men and women became much more egocentric. And that egocentricity created all kinds of institutions which are very unflattering to us. So we need, I think, to, if this idea were accepted, that this is what happened, This is why we're conscious. This is why we're so uncomfortable with consciousness. And this is where we are. And somehow this dialogue could go on outside the distorting effects of Christianity, male anxiety, and so forth and so on. Then I think the conclusion would be we need some very radical social reforms. Not simply, obviously, the legalization of spiritual transformation through substances, but all of our institutions have been built up on the assumption of ego and dominance hierarchy. And deconstructing that is really what the future is all about, I think, and it's a challenge. Does that go to it sufficiently? Don't be shy.
Except for I feel like, I also feel like just in general, in this theory of the evolution of consciousness, female is left out. I mean, here we have the theories of erection and arousal and male dominance sort of tendency. I guess it's just that if a matrifocal culture can exist only under chemicals, what is the implication of that? I mean, yes, transformation is necessary.
Well, I don't call it matrifocal. I call it partnership. I don't think there's a pendulum swing between patriarchy and matriarchy. I think there is partnership, which is appropriate role expression. Everybody does what is appropriate to their position, and then there is the assigned role of the hierarchical situation. I think it was in Science last week. Here is a frontier that is breaking right now, which is it's just being realized that men and women are incredibly different anatomically and at the microanatomical level. I think there was a list of 40 physical differences between the brains of men and women. And in a sense, this is pure speculation, but I believe that especially in the archaic situation, well, we don't even have to talk about the archaic situation. In 1800, the average American woman gave birth 13 times. The average American woman in 1800. So you put a statistic like that against the phenomenon of menstruation, and what you have then when you look at women is a life absolutely rooted in the rhythms and the fact of nature. Men are it's more like a closed system. It's sealed off, and there isn't this connection into the biological world. So men are potentially more capable of getting off the track, if you want to put it that way, meaning leaving this Gaian creed of symbiotic self-reinforcement. It's very obvious in the years I've been doing this. This looks to me like a fairly balanced group, but my groups tend to be heavily male. And women, in my own experience, tend to be far more casual psychedelic users than men. If you just look at cannabis use, usually women are very casual. A woman who is truly a smoker is a rare thing. Well, that would go along with menstruation and birth and breastfeeding. Women are involved in biology in a way that men need not be. They can choose, and that's why abstraction is the great realm of male activity and so forth.
I guess I want to pick up your example of women in the 1800s giving birth so many times and point out that also was an aberration that came from what I consider to be the learned behavior of males into domination. That when women were in control of their own reproductive cycles, there was not that many births. They were appropriately spaced because the sexual activity was not dominant, and the women determined when sexual activity would take place based on what was best for the community and the offspring.
No, you're right. I'd probably yield on that. I guess then, but I try to save the point by saying this. You're right. Probably in this archaic situation, women had knowledge of plant contraceptives, and they were well in control of
were not forced into sexual activity, which was an important piece of the domination cycle. That women controlled the reproductive cycle and the sexual cycle, and so children were safe. It was when the concept of domination began that they lost power over when they would have sex, and then also how often they would have babies. And that was a real turning point in that reproductive aspect.
But don't you imagine that in a world without anesthetic, even if you gave birth only 3 or 4 times in your life, these would be immense boundary-dissolving psychedelic extravaganzas.
I don't have any problem with the conclusion. It's just sort of the pathway there and what the constructs were before that.
No, well, I think you're right that such a large number of pregnancies and births indicates a pattern of subjugation. There was something else I wanted to say about that. Well, it'll come back. Yeah.
I'd just like to add something about gender. I think we need to be really aware of how biochemically mediated it is. I have a friend who went through a hormonal change, became a woman over a 5-month period, hormonally. And you can feel his aggressions drop away with being generous in the body. And then 5 months later, he changed his mind and came back.
He hates being generous and loving. Yes, it's me.
And you can feel his aggression coming back, and now he's in a really, actually quite beautiful and androgynous state.
Well, now I've seen it from both ends of the spectrum.
That's what you said. You really understand how women feel and how they think, and you just totally understand women.
Oh, I know what I wanted to say about this. I don't want to spend too much time on it, but you should be aware of this. And it's interesting. It's always fun to talk about sexuality and so forth and so on. But you're probably aware of these things called bonobos, these so-called pygmy chimpanzees. They're actually not noticeably smaller than ordinary chimpanzees, but they are a distinct species. First of all, we differ from chimpanzees by 2% of our genome. 98% of us is chimpanzee. We differ from the bonobos in about the same amount. Chimpanzees are male-dominant, highly monogamous, very territorial, so forth and so on. The bonobos, which are to a non-zoologist indistinguishable from the chimpanzees, all aggression is mediated through sex. Incredible. I'm surprised such animals can exist because I would have thought a virus would have jumped into this situation. But the bonobos are incredibly highly sexed animals. All forms of sexual activity are going on almost constantly, and all aggression and all social difference and everything is ameliorated by sexual activity, usually initiated by the female. Well, if you look at these two animals, chimpanzee and bonobo, you can't tell them apart. I think what it means is that this matter of our sexual expression and dominance and so forth and so on is riding on a cusp of some sort. We can go either way. That's why we're the only animal species where there is no defined style of pairing. In other words, we have monogamy in some societies, polygamy, polyandry, a whole smorgasbord of social and sexual arrangements that we will tolerate. No other creature is like that. And I think it indicates that we are in a zone of ambiguity on this matter, and that means we have a lot of leeway. We can send ourselves one way or the other. We can build a nightmarish, male-dominated, crypto-fascist kind of situation, or we can go the other way. Bonobo or chimpanzee, we're looking down both those roads. Yeah.
Are you saying that basically as a species we have not been stabilized because the boundaries or the
Well, we've been destabilized. I think we were stabilized in the chimpanzee dominator mode, and then 100,000 years of psilocybin use put us closer to the bonobos. Now, the bonobos are almost extinct. There's only a few thousand of them left. they need to be studied. There was a paper recently, I can't give you the citation, but if you write me, I can, studying chimpanzees in Africa. They would only leave the nest, they would only leave the trees and descend down onto the ground to forage, but the only thing they would do this for were mushrooms.
Well, seriously enough, the pygmy chimps are really the only animal where any success has been gleaned in the sign language communications and the more modern versions of that. But the pygmy chimps are the ones which can use the message boards actually to some effectiveness. The only ones that appear to have language ability. You know, the oaks for dolphins, whales, and regular chimps is still a blank. But the pygmy chimps, they're doing it. So here we have the language thing come on the cusp for them.
So it would be very interesting to know if psilocybin, I mean, they might be an image of us 500,000 years ago. You know, I mean, in other words, were we to go extinct and the bonobos to flourish, there might be another anthropoid species take the stage in 1 million or 2 years. Yeah.
This is sort of a question to mainline the psilocybin. In my experience, I've seen many men, especially a lot of heavy hitters in the psychedelic movement, take high doses and don't care one hoot about gender issues or justice or equality. So I'm not sure that has, I think the psychedelic experience can reinforce all your prejudices, but psilocybin itself can't necessarily open you up, melt boundaries, have you seek out justice.
Well, I guess I'm more of a believer than you are. I just say they didn't take enough. And and the other thing is, you mentioned these were heavy hitters in the male heavy hitters in the psychedelic movement. It may just be that some people can't be saved. That Christ himself couldn't lift some people out of chaos. I haven't had that experience. I mean, I think that...
You could ask the women in the psychedelic movement about their experience. Because, I mean, you come from a certain perspective of male dominator. And you check it out.
What specifically should I ask them about their experience?
If they feel that the men in their lives change through strictly high doses of psilocybin or other psychedelic use, that there's more justice. I mean, my thing is that the family is the most interesting political stage there is. Is there justice in the family? Is there a partnership model happening in the family? Is the father actively taking care of the children in the family?
Well, that's a sort of a different question. I liked your first question better. Do they see in the men in their lives a tendency toward a softening or justice?
But the stage of that is really a relationship, the family.
Yeah, the problem I have with that is I think the modern family is, first of all, a very modern invention and basically a cauldron for the production of neuroses.
But that's what we have to work with. That's what we have to work with.
Well, let's ask these women, how about this proposition that psychedelics make men smoother, evener, more... Does anybody want to denounce that? Yeah. What complicates it is notice that the male-dominated society we're living in is just fanatically concerned to suppress this. And to me, that's a sign that it must threaten it at a very basic level. And yet it seems silly. I mean, they're more concerned about suppressing psilocybin than, all kinds of obviously greater social ills. Why? Well, it's because it disrupts their model of how things should be run. Over here? Yeah.
I was just going to say, I hope that we can assume that there are some men out there who aren't dominators and trying to sort of grind everybody else down, particularly women. There are men out there who have worked out relationships with women and with other men that are cooperative partnerships. Well, and a lot of them never took psilocybin.
Well, you live in a society, you take upon yourself the tone of the time. I mean, a lot of people wear tie-dye who never took LSD. You sort of take upon yourself the ambiance of your time. I don't really like the getting it into a gender thing. I really think ego, here's the way I put it. Ego is like a cyst which will begin to grow in you, whether you are male or female, unless you take a psychedelic. The psychedelic is that it will dissolve this cyst. The cyst is in your personality. It's a tumor. It shouldn't be there. I mean, we do need to have egos, little egos, so that when I take you out to dinner, I put the food I order in my mouth, you put the food you order in your mouth. That's what an ego is for. But if I start giving you orders, then that's completely inappropriate. So rather than genderize it, which I think is a mistake, because let's face it, after thousands of years of this maladaptive cultural style, many women are hard-driving, egomaniacal, ambitious. It's a bad style, and men may be born into it, and women may be infected by it, but there's plenty of it around in men and women. Yeah.
I've been involved in like the psychedelic sort of therapy, and basically people are drawn to it if they're willing to look at their own shit, and that's what the mushroom does. And seriously enough, that's what comes from. And the person who's willing to do that is like the dissolution of the ego, and it has reverberations for people who won't or aren't in a position to do that, or they're so involved in protecting their ego that they're not in that place yet. But that both men and women benefit from that, and it goes beyond that for people who will or will not use that.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, we should at some point in all of this say, obviously, not everyone should take psychedelic plants. Well, then the question automatically follows, well, who shouldn't? Well, in practical terms, we all know people who are lightly here, who have diminished self-esteem, so forth and so on. For them, ego dissolution is not the goal. They have been so victimized by egomaniacs that they have no sense of self. So for them, they should be encouraged to build up an internal structure in their personality and a coherent reference point in the self. But that is a state of dis-ease that most of us are not like that. Most of us are ordinary or more toward the spectrum of ego dominance, and we profit from the psychedelic experience. Women, I think, are less excited by psychedelics because they experience, by and large, it has less of an impact. I mean, I've seen many, many people change their lives on a dime, like after a big LSD trip, but most of those people were men. Most of those people were men. Yeah.
What you thought about traditional indigenous cultures such as the Aborigines in Australia, I stayed with a group for about 3 months now, and I found it to be a very male-dominated, aggressive culture, and yet they were using shamanic and psychedelic plants for ritual and ceremonial use.
Well, I mean, here's what I think. Once this African paradisical partnership thing was disrupted and people were scattered to the four corners of the earth, the memory never was lost. And there is even what's called a nostalgia for paradise today, throughout time. The belief that in the past it was better. And since the Renaissance, it's been fashionable to dismiss this as a kind of naivete, the grass is greener kind of thing. But I think probably things were better, and that our nostalgia for paradise is what has caused us to be so subject to abuse and use of drugs. No other animal shares this pattern of behavior. Sometimes elephants will push down fences to get to rotting fruit, and birds get drunk and fall down on their little feeders and this sort of thing. But human beings addict to a startling spectrum, not only of substances, but of behaviors. We addict to each other. I mean, heroin withdrawal and a broken heart look and feel exactly the same way. You know, abandonment, bursting into tears, insomnia, inability to eat. I mean, does this person have a broken heart, or are they getting off junk? You can't tell. And we tend to addict. And I think this is a kind of, we feel in ourselves a certain incompleteness since the breakup of the African Partnership Society. And, you know, alcohol doesn't quite do it. Cannabis is good, but doesn't quite go far enough. We've tried all kinds of things. And interestingly, in the last 100 years, the science of ethnography and anthropology has scoured the world and brought back to us data which we didn't have 100, 120 years ago. Data about peyote, ayahuasca, datura, psilocybin, morning glory, so forth and so on. The materia medica of the remote human cultures of the planet is now available. And I think it comes not a moment too late. That's why I called my book The Archaic Revival. I really see the whole cultural impulse of the 20th century as an impulse toward the archaic.